Hello, class, and welcome to this lecture on fiscal policy in our course on principles of macroeconomics. To give you a roadmap of what we're going to discuss in this lecture, we're going to define what fiscal policy is and what it is not. We'll then dive into expansionary policy, talk about some of the examples in American history of uses of a discretionary expansionary fiscal policy. We'll then talk about contractionary policy. We'll talk about deficit spending and the consequences of that, such as crowding out. And then we'll do a quick recap of aggregate supply and aggregate demand within the context of both monetary and fiscal policy to wrap up the lecture. So previously, when we talked about monetary policy, that was enacted by a central bank, which is a government entity in of itself, but it's basically it's centralized in terms of the banking system, but it's decentralized from the actual executive or legislative or judicial branches of government. When we talked about aggregate demand, I talked about how policies can help induce aggregate demand, and in spite of different economic theories that have suggested that maybe they don't work as well, generally speaking, we believe that these policies have some sort of effect in times in which they are needed, such as times of high inflation for contractionary policy, or times of recession or economic depression for times of expansionary policy. Basically, the main economic policy, though, is fiscal policy. So when Keynes envisioned an economic policy that would try to expand the economy in times of either liquidity traps or low aggregate demand, this is the economic tool that he surmised would be effective. When we talk about fiscal policy, we have to look at it from the perspective of government at the federal level. So the state level or a local government can implement policies that try to facilitate economic activity, job creation, wealth creation, new housing, things of that nature, better education. But in order for us to truly estimate it at a macroeconomic level, we have to have fiscal policy that has to be federal. So if a state individually decides to undertake a new construction project, or they expand unemployment benefits, or they cut taxes, those things will have an impact on the macroeconomy, but they will have a disproportionate and large effect on that state level economy. So if you're looking at the perspective of the macroeconomy of that state or that local government, yes, that would be true. But in order for us to look at it in the context of the entire nation and GDP and things like that, these policies need to be enacted at a federal level so that they impact the economy as a whole. So even if California or New York undertakes some sort of, or Texas undertakes some sort of a large-scale economic policy, it will have some impact on the overall economy, but in terms of truly assessing its equitable impact when we're hoping for times of recovery, when we're using expansionary policy, or to curtail inflation in times of contractionary policy, it needs to be kind of administered from the top down, and so it has an impact on the entire economy instead of just one specific area. When we talk about fiscal policy, we're usually talking about discretionary fiscal policy. So there are aspects of fiscal policy that exist that don't have to be authorized or passed through Congress during a time of economic need. Those are known as automatic stabilizers. So they are a form of fiscal policy that's kind of been built and baked into our legislature and codified, so that when we do have cyclical budget changes in terms of recessions where there's lower tax revenue and we expand our spending because of unemployment insurance or transfer payments and things like that, those are going to be something that Congress doesn't even have to worry about. They might actually authorize an expansion of that in terms of the length of time, but the actual amount is going to increase because of the fact that more people are claiming that benefit. So during the Great Recession, more people applied for disability benefits than ever before. I think it was 3 times higher than it normally was. So that benefit is built into the system, but it might cycle and expand and contract based on the business cycle itself. So fewer people are unemployed during economic expansion, so fewer people are claiming it, but during times of recession, more people are claiming it, and so as a result, that spending increases. So those are known as automatic stabilizers. When we talk about expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, we're talking about a discretionary policy that's done of large scale at the federal level and done actively. So if there's some minor legislative tweak that happens with the budget annually, that's not necessarily a discretionary policy. It might have an effect on the economy, but usually we're looking at acute problems in the economy that we're trying to solve when we're addressing these concerns of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy was surmised by Keynes during the Great Depression. He wrote The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. So we were well within to the Great Depression, just a couple of years away from World War II. You'll notice that when we talk about the examples of expansionary fiscal policy, that one of these policies was the New Deal, which was happening around the same time. It wasn't like FDR had Keynes on speed dial. In fact, most people didn't really respect Keynes's opinion initially, so it wasn't as if FDR's economist was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was British. And it wasn't like Neville Chamberlain called him up and was like, hey, yo, we've got this economist in London that's really good. So let's try this out. That wasn't happening. It was more so the federal government treated, or FDR treated the regular budget as the regular budget, but treated New Deal programs and things like that as an emergency fund due to the high unemployment and low economic activity of the 1930s. Expansionary fiscal policy is implemented during those types of situations. The goal is trying to recover quickly and do it so because the not the government, but the economy itself, that invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about, isn't quite able to make it work quickly. So when you have 23% unemployment, it's going to take a while for people to get rehired. It's going to be take a while for things to kind of get ramped up again. So a goal is to kind of have government provide some spending because they're kind of the central arm. If they're creating the currency and they're kind of in charge of things, and they're basically the centralization of all of the tax revenue that comes from all taxpayers across the country, both businesses and from the household side, that they can basically inject money into the economy through programs, stimulus packages, tax cuts, and things like that to try and boost the economy in a time in which it really needs it. So there are two types of expansionary fiscal policy that could be implemented. We've talked about these in the past, but just to reiterate them, the first one is increasing spending. So this is typically what happens in a time of recession, is that instead of cutting taxes, because most people essentially have their taxes taken out of their paycheck and then they pay a bill or get a refund at the end of the year based on their deductions and credits and things like that. So if you have an acute issue in terms of economic activity, you're probably going to see more of an increase in spending because that tax cut really isn't going to affect you if you don't have a job and you aren't making money anyways. So they usually look at it from the spending side. So what they'll do is they'll increase the amount of government spending. And when we talked about aggregate expenditures and aggregate demand, there's a multiplier effect that happens. So if the government spends money on projects, then those projects result in hiring workers. And if those hired workers are hired, they get paid an income. And if they get paid an income, then they spend that money on goods and services, and it increases the consumption component of GDP. Additionally, businesses, if they get a contract for this project, they might be more willing to invest more because of that increase in expectations of profitability, and then they end up with an increase in investment, and then we end up getting increases in G, C, and I, and hopefully it facilitates economic growth at a rate that is faster than the actual initial amount of spending by the government. I'll talk about kind of some of the implications of that when we talk about the examples of expansionary policy. Sometimes this doesn't work as intended. Sometimes it doesn't work as powerful as the multiplier might suggest, and I can get into details about why that might be the case. Second option is that the government can decrease taxes. So I said again, this is probably something that they would do in a time where it's not acute, but the economy is weak. So for those who are losing their jobs, it's always acute. But let's say that unemployment's creeped up from 4 to 6%. That's probably bad, and that's indicative of a recession, but it's probably not necessarily indicative of a need to have some sort of extreme measure of economic stimulus, unlike what we saw in 2008, where basically the financial sector collapsed, and in 2020, when we saw unemployment jump from basically its lowest levels at the U3 measurement of 3.4 to 3.6% up into double digits within a 2 to 3 month period. So those are times when tax cuts might not necessarily be useful, but in a time of weak economic activity, taxes cuts can be beneficial because it puts more disposable income in the hands of households, and it puts more money in the pockets of firms. So hopefully the theory is that if you do it across the board, individuals will spend more with their disposable income, and firms will take that money and reinvest it. The problem is if you do it only from the corporate side and not the household side, you potentially have this risk of giving money to firms, and then they basically have a publicly traded company, and they have a fiduciary duty to compensate their shareholders. So if the company has extra profits just because of a tax cut, not because of actual sales, they may have an obligation to give that money to their shareholders, which is a much smaller concentration of the population of people that most likely probably already have enough money where their marginal propensity to consume is going to be pretty darn low compared to someone who is working a minimum wage retail job. So there are some trade-offs and benefits, but the goal is in both cases to increase economic activity through either reducing taxes by giving more money to households and firms, so hopefully they'll invest and spend, or just putting money in their pockets and having that money spent through the economy on goods and services. So some examples of discretionary fiscal policy that occurred. The New Deal occurred in the 30s, and basically the New Deal created government agencies such as the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Civilian Conservation Corps and things like that. So the TVA established a lot of dams that exist in the country. Because of some environmental impacts, they might actually be taking some of those away, but the CCC basically established a lot of the trails that you hike at national parks. So those were done due to an emergency stimulus package established by Congress in the 1930s. So if you want a new trail at your national park, I guess you need an economic crisis. So that's the big example, but because we've had two kind of acute economic situations, so in between these, we've had a pretty ho-hum economy for a lot of people, not for everyone, because we had some structural changes due to technology. But in between them, between 2008 and 2020, was okay. But 2008-2009 resulted in substantial economic decline due to the financial sector and the housing bubble issues. So in 2008, the Bush administration passed the Economic Stimulus Act, which basically gave households $600 for an individual, $1,200 for married couples, and the goal was for them to spend that money on goods and services. The problem was that during that economic crisis, lots of people were losing their jobs and struggling to make mortgage payments or rent payments, so that money went directly to those things, or to paying off mortgages, which are just debt. So it's almost treated as net savings at that point, so your MPC isn't as high as you would expect. I think it was only 30 to 40% of the actual stimulus checks went towards new consumption goods and services, and the rest went to debt or savings, which meant it didn't have as nearly the multiplier effect that you would expect. You can do the calculation where if instead of having like an MPC of 0.8 where your multiplier is 5, you have an MPC of 0.4 where your multiplier is only 2.5. So you're getting basically half of the actual economic growth that you were hoping for. The America Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, that was established as kind of a works and infrastructure program. So if you saw roads being paved and redone on the highways during those about 2009 to 2011, usually it would say that this was paid for by the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So that was established under the Obama administration in his first year of office. In 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed to increase standard deductions and temporarily cut taxes for households, but permanently cut taxes on corporations. So the goal of this was to improve investment and create jobs due to the fact that corporate tax rates were lower, so they had higher profit margins so they could afford more workers. Again, I said the pushback is that if you have a skewed tax cut towards corporations and they are publicly traded corporations that have a fiduciary to or shareholders, the money is going to go there, not necessarily to investment. So some of it did, most of it went to investment. So a lot of the airline industry had stock buybacks to basically to line their pockets, and then what ended up happening in 2020 was that they needed money again because the money that they could have had from that was nowhere and not in reserves. So when airline volume basically ground down to almost a halt, not quite a halt, but almost a halt, they didn't necessarily have that money available to them. It has helped households, though, with standard deduction improvements, so that they now have a little bit of extra money coming in, or they have a little bit of extra money at the end of the year. But it was mostly focused on the corporations in it. And as we'll talk about, there's some crowding out risks as a result. In 2020, the CARES Act was passed by Congress. This basically included a stimulus bill like the Bush administration, but twice as large, where it was $1,200 for an individual and $2,400 for a married couple and $500 per children. It had some loan money for small businesses so they could make payroll, and if they had under a certain amount of employees or income, they wouldn't have to pay the grant back if they rehired their employees after coronavirus orders of stay at home and things like that were lifted. It also had monies for industries like the airline industry or healthcare industry to help kind of soften the blow or to expand access to personal protective equipment and other technologies that could assist with the treatment of patients. So that one was about $2 trillion in 2020 nominal dollars, and it is basically twice as much as what the Fed did in terms of quantitative easing. back in 2008 through 2012. So these are implemented at times of acute issues, and so here's some examples of them, and we'll talk about some of the potential long-term consequences of them after I talk about contractionary policy. Before I do that, I just wanted to visualize what the theoretical multiplier effect would be. So the shift from AD1 to that dotted line of AD is basically the increase in exogenous or autonomous spending by the government. So if we think about our aggregate expenditures and our multiplier, simple deposit, or not our simple deposit, our spending multiplier, basically the exogenous spending is the shift from AD1 to AD, but then because of the multiplier effect and that money cycling through, we actually shift all the way to AD2. And so our intersection point is not at B, but at C because of increased prices as a result of an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And we end up with a increase in aggregate demand from A to C due to the multiplier effect. Although we'll find out that that might not necessarily be the case because of crowding out. Okay, as promised, in terms of contractionary fiscal policy, you might be wondering, well, why would a government ever want to raise taxes or cut spending? Well, one would be to try and be budget conscious or financially sound. But the second real reason is due to the fact that there are going to be times in which we have inflationary issues. In the 1970s, we had stagflation, so we simultaneously had high inflation due to oil supply shocks, and we had low economic activity in terms of a recession. One of the concerns before coronavirus in 2020 was that labor was tight. So unemployment was around 3.4%, so we had upward pressure on wages, which is good for individual households and in terms of market forces, instead of people being able to peg your value to a legally determined price floor minimum wage that may or may not be indicative of the actual market wage that should exist. It basically made things more competitive. But the consequence was that if there wasn't enough labor out there in the market, in order for you to get your project completed, you would have to get a worker from somewhere else. And to convince them to go from their current project to a new project, or from one job to another job, you have to pay them more money. So by paying them more money, you get them, but really your project isn't necessarily going to yield anything more than the other person. So just because they're getting paid more doesn't necessarily make them more productive unless you give them long-run aggregate supply tools like education or technology or tools to be able to make them more productive. So anyways, you get basically a net zero change in GDP, but you get a 5 to 10% increase in your costs due to the increase in your wages that you're paying. So if that happens and the government doesn't do anything about it, you're going to end up with a net change of zero in GDP or even negative, and you're going to have increasing price levels, because when firms adjust their prices and wages, it results in a shift to the left in the short-run aggregate supply curve, which would basically move down your equilibrium in terms of where it intersects with a fixed aggregate demand curve, and it's going to be at a higher price. Because remember, when supply decreases, quantity decreases and price increases. So the same is true for this model here. So again, what we want to do is we want to keep that level of GDP pretty consistent, but keep prices even more stable is the even more important goal. So what ends up happening in a time of contractionary policy is you might get engaged into an activity where you're slowing the economy down, but what you're doing by slowing the economy down is you're keeping prices from getting out of control. So typically, since fiscal and monetary policy are from the demand side, not the supply side, so the supply side is what's causing that upward pressure if you don't do anything. If we decrease aggregate demand for some reason, remember, if we decrease demand, we lower prices and lower quantity. So if we're going to lower quantity in both cases, the best of the options is probably to lower prices at the same time. Because if it's more expensive and you lose your job, or it's more expensive and there's fewer jobs available, it's going to be tougher for the economy to continue. But if there's fewer jobs available, but your prices and your cost of living are decreasing, that can allow for a more stable recovery if we end up triggering a recession or end up in a recession. So contractionary fiscal policy can come in one of two ways. It could be from the government decreasing their spending, which will decrease G, and then again, unfortunately, when you increase G, you get a multiplier effect because of there's increased projects, more hiring, more income, more spending. You get a multiplier effect in the other direction, where basically if you cut G, if there's a government contractor that was planning on that contract and it gets canceled by the government, then they lose money, which means that they cut production. When they cut production, they cut labor. That increases unemployment, and fewer households have income to spend, and so they spend less. So you get a multiplier effect in the other direction, unfortunately. The government can also increase taxes. So if they increase the tax rate on households and firms, that's going to decrease disposable income, because disposable income is income minus taxes. So you're going to get a reduction in your disposable income, and simultaneously, if you're paying more taxes out as a firm, then that means your profitability margin or your profit margin is shrinking a little bit. So as a result, you're going to not be willing to spend as much if you have a fixed budget for your projects. So this can result in a reduction. So again, decreasing spending, increasing taxes results in a reduction in aggregate demand, which will shift aggregate demand down to the left, and that will result in a lower level of GDP at equilibrium, but with lower prices. So the theory is if you don't do anything, the supply curve is going to shift and put upward pressure on prices and reduce GDP anyway. So let's get ahead of it and stabilize prices and try not to mess with the economy too much. But if it's going to reduce anyways, or stabilize or stagnate, you might as well do it with cheaper prices than more expensive ones. So this graph just visualizes how aggregate demand changes when we engage in expansionary and contractionary policies respectively. So if we engage in an expansionary fiscal policy, we're going to shift aggregate demand to the right from 81 to 82. So that's represented by graph A. And then graph B represents contractionary policy, where basically if the government decides to increase taxes or cut spending, that's going to shift 80 to the left. So really what you're trying to avoid when you engage in a contractionary policy is this from happening. So if we didn't engage in in contractionary fiscal policy, then we would end up here, and we would be at an even higher price level, say like 115. So if the option is to be at point C with higher prices and the same level of GDP, most people would choose option B, and that's the goal behind contractionary policy. But even though that's the better choice, that doesn't mean that constituents of the representatives will be happy about it, and so they tend to not engage in contractionary policy because of their political risk by doing so. However, we might determine that one of these days that's going to be inevitable, due to the fact that we have to figure out where the government spends their money and where it comes from. So we did a proof earlier in the course showing that savings is equal to investment, and public savings was tax revenues minus transfer payments minus government spending, and household savings or private saving was income plus transfer payments minus consumption minus taxes. So the government's money comes from taxes. So if they spend more than they collect in taxes, then they have a budget deficit. And if they spend less than they collect in taxes, then it's a budget surplus. We had 2 years of a budget surplus in the mid-90s, but otherwise we've been continuously deficit spending more and more every single year since those times. And so our national debt has exploded from a few trillion to about $21 trillion to 25 trillion and beyond every couple of years, because of this. And the annual budget shortfall in a pre-coronavirus year was like 2019, and that was a budget deficit of about $1 trillion. So we were spending $1 trillion more, or effectively 5% of our GDP more than we were collecting in tax revenues. So if the government keeps increasing the amount of debt that they undertake, it's risky. Just like you, if you live beyond your means and you take out a $60,000 car loan and you buy a $300,000 house, but you're making $12 an hour and you have one income in your household, there's probably a risk associated with doing that because you may or may not even have enough money, depending on how many hours you work, to cover those expenses. So in order to cover those expenses, you borrow more money to cover those expenses, and then it snowballs and it keeps getting bigger and bigger until you become insolvent and you default on your debt. So that could be that maybe you just don't have enough money to pay your mortgage anymore. So you fall behind, you become delinquent on your mortgage, and it goes into foreclosure, and you can't make your car payment, so that car gets repossessed. Or you just have a bunch of credit card debt that you accrued due to the fact that you needed it to pay off the debt that was already there, and so you end up filing for bankruptcy. Now, the difference between you and the federal government is that you can file for bankruptcy and then basically you can have a clean slate and start over again. If the federal government defaults on their debt, then you have this crisis that happens because of the fact that the government that issues the currency but is also the major kind of muscle in terms of the mechanics of the country and the political structure and the function of the day-to-day, it loses its credibility, and it's hard for people to have faith in the currency, have faith in the government structure, and have faith in the market system in that country. And so you end up with a potential collapse in terms of the economy or in the governmental structure. So what would happen is when the government, so right now what the government does is they borrow money in the form of treasury bonds, but every year the amount of interest that they have to pay out to get those treasury bonds goes up, and it's accumulating over time. So what ends up happening is you end up with a potential point in the future where the interest payments that we owe on our debts from the past will be higher than the tax revenues that are collected by the government. And if that happens, then that means that you basically won't even have a functioning government. So all of the government programs that are provided through those tax revenues and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and disability and education loans and all that stuff, you won't have it anymore, but you'll still be paying the same tax rate to get nothing, so we don't default. So the way the government can prepare for that, or if they'll do it in a lurch or in a hasty form because they're running out of time and they have no money, is they can raise their tax rates or they can cut spending. So a contractionary policy is basically what they would do in a time in which they have a sovereign debt crisis or solvency issues. This is visualized in Europe. So Greece has been insolvent substantially. You had Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Ireland all struggling with paying debts off and having this. So in Europe, what you hear a lot is a term known as austerity measures. And those austerity measures are basically just cutting spending and increasing taxes to try and keep themselves from defaulting on their debts. One of the immediate consequences that we will see, though, from this, so instead of it being kind of something that we just punt into the future and worry about it later, there is an immediate consequence of the fact that the government has to borrow money to function in a day-to-day operation. And this is known as crowding out. And the reason why it's called crowding out is because the government basically crowds the market for loanable funds and the money demand market. And basically, because they issue bonds, they get their money first because they pay interest on it and it's considered a safe asset. Meanwhile, someone that wants to take out a commercial loan to start a business or a real estate project is going to be competing in that same market for that same pool of money, but they're going to be kind of secondary. So if you've heard of prior appropriation water rights, basically the government's the senior appropriator, everyone else is downstream as a junior appropriator, so whatever's left is what we get. That, or you can think about it from a demand side perspective, where the government increases the overall market demand for the money and pushes upward pressure on interest rates and prices for borrowing that money, which might price out firms from that competition. So as a result, the government and private results in private investment projects being canceled or reduced because of the fact that they just can't or aren't willing to pay that higher price to compete with the government for that money to borrow. So I will again show you the graph of the market for loanable funds to show you how crowding out can kind of have an impact on our overall production. So think about like if the government engages in a policy and they spend, well, that crowding out might actually result in a offset that isn't one-to-one for the due to the crowding out in terms of the overall economic growth, because if aggregate demand is encompassing consumption, investment, and government spending, and government spending pushes out investment, then you're going to see a reduction in investment, which will push AD back somewhat, but not the whole way, but still you'll end up with less effective of a result than if you were not having to borrow money. So again, the government is causing money demand 1 to shift to money demand 2. And when that happens, we assume a vertical money supply, so holding everything else constant, the Fed isn't injecting money in through buying securities and open market operations. We end up with a upward pressure on interest rates, and if there's an upward pressure on interest rates, then people are less incentivized to borrow, and if they're less incentivized to borrow, they borrow less, which results in less investment and consumption compared to the government theoretical multiplier effect, and you end up with a result that isn't as effective as you were hoping. Here is the example of that. So AD2 crowding out is not a intermediate point, but that demonstrates the multiplier effect. In fact, it's the opposite. So if we include the multiplier effect into our exogenous spending from expansionary fiscal policy, you're going to shift from A to B and AD1 to AD2 with no crowding out. Unfortunately, as a result of crowding out, a lot of investment projects that otherwise would have been there without the crowding out get canceled, and so you end up with a result at point C instead of point B. So crowding out pushes you back away from where you intended to go because of the fact that you're having to borrow, and now you're making other entities in the same market system that's measured here compete with you for those resources. So again, the long-term impact of this is, okay, tomorrow we're not going to have this issue, but say if we keep up on the trend we're on 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to have a situation where we might have to increase taxes or print money or do something to solve this issue. Because again, the government could just have the Treasury print $20 trillion and our debts are cleared tomorrow. The problem with that is that $20 trillion is now flooding in the market, which means that that's going to put a high upward pressure on inflation, and that's going to make things much more expensive, and that's why you have situations like Zimbabwe with runaway inflation, or Germany post-World War I, where you have images of people wheeling German marks and wheelbarrows to buy bread. So we don't want to be in that situation. Cryptocurrency is one of the avenues that is trying to alleviate this exact problem, that with all the liquidity in the market, it's going to put upward pressure on inflation and downward pressure on currency values. So your actual purchasing power might go down, and trying to keep it scarce so that way it doesn't get out of control and decentralize it, so you don't have a government dependent currency. But the government might end up increasing taxes or cutting spending as a result to protect this from happening if it comes up in the future. I wanted to finish this lecture by just doing another graphical recap of aggregate supply and aggregate demand within the context of our policy implications. So we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Y represents GDP, PL represents the price level. We have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And then we have a long run aggregate supply curve. So long run aggregate supply represents Y sub P, which is our potential GDP and represents kind of the classical model in the long run Keynesian. Our actual equilibrium occurs at the point where these two intersect. So this is our actual level of GDP, and this is our actual price level. The problem is that this is falling short of long run aggregate supply, so we would call this an output gap. So it's an output gap or GDP gap. You might hear it called that too. And that's a time in which we would want to implement an expansionary policy. So we can do expansionary monetary policy, which results in buying securities, open market operations, shifting that money supply curve to the right, putting downward pressure on interest rates, and hopefully if the banks lend, you get an increase in consumption and investment. Or it could be expansionary fiscal policy, where you're cutting taxes or you're increasing government spending. Regardless of the case, you're going to end up with a shift to the right of your aggregate demand curve, and hopefully maybe through a multiplier effect through government spending, you end up getting a full-on shift to 83 and ending up at your long-run macro equilibrium. Now, if we have a situation in which we have a inflationary gap, which is a situation in which the overall level of equilibrium output is higher than potential GDP, then you might want to get into that type of solution. So here's our aggregate demand curve and our short run aggregate supply, vertical long run aggregate supply curve. So we are here, that's where we want to be, but we're actually beyond it. We're actually down here at Y star and PL star again. So the reason why we want to engage in the contractionary policy is this would be a situation in which unemployment's like 3.8% or something like that. When unemployment is 3.8%, that's frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So you've got a few people that are on the market, but there's 20 people trying to hire those 4 people to fill their positions, and then the remaining unemployed don't qualify. So they're going to be unemployed regardless of who applies for this job, because they don't have the requisite skills for the position. So if that happens, then you have to compete, and then you have to pay higher prices, and when you pay higher prices, that cuts into your budget, so you produce less because of those higher prices, so you end up with a supply side shift to the left, which puts you down here at Y2, and now we have prices of PL2 that are even higher. Let's say there's a supply shock of oil prices going up. without any intervention, and then we end up back here at SRAS3. So we're now back at our potential GDP with prices higher. To avoid that scenario from happening, what the government might do instead is, if I redraw this out, is they might say, you know what, we know this is going to happen. Oil prices might get out of control, or there's upward pressure on wages because of tight labor market. Let's get ahead of this and let's shift aggregate demand to the left by selling securities, or the government can cut spending or increase taxes. And the goal is you're going to end up decreasing GDP in either case, but the goal is to avoid inflation from getting out of control. So you have lower prices, but the same level of GDP that you would have ended up with if you let things do things on their own. So most of the time, expansionary policy is done by both the Fed, or the central bank, and the government legislature. But contractionary policy is usually almost exclusively left to the devices of the central bank, because of the fact that those who are trying to get reelected don't have to take the heat for it, and they could just blame the Fed for it. So hopefully that gives you a decent recap of all of the inner workings of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. However, it is important to remember all those variables that shift these curves, because they are important in terms of understanding how these policies work, why they might not work, or what the underpinnings of the model are, so that way if there is something else that's happening that's causing the aggregate supply or aggregate demand curve to shift that isn't because of policy, you can understand why. So that concludes our lecture on fiscal policy. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, best of luck on your assessments in this course or any other courses that you have with me or anyone. And I look forward to talking soon.